right. So you want to know how to like measure those like kind of fuzzy concepts, right?
Yeah.
The ones that just seem impossible to quantify.
Like the so-called immeasurables.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got you covered. Today, we're going to be exploring this book called How to Measure Anything by Douglas W. Hubbard.
Yeah, it's a
Really cool book.
game changer.
It is. It
It-
really is. The book argues that even the things we think are impossible to measure can actually be measured if you approach it the right way.
What I find so intriguing about this book is how it challenges like our preconceived notions about what measurement even means.
Yeah.
We often think it has to be like perfectly precise, right?
Right.
Boiling everything down to a single number.
Like pinpoint accuracy.
Yeah, but Hubbard suggests that that's not always the case.
Yeah, and it's funny because you think about like, I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but like stepping on a bathroom scale
Yo.
and it's super precise, but you know it's off by like 5 pounds.
Yeah.
That precision is useless if it's not accurate.
Exactly. It doesn't really matter. Hubbard really focuses on this idea that measurement is all about reducing uncertainty. It's not necessarily about achieving perfect accuracy.
Okay, so it's about getting enough information to make a smarter decision,
Exactly.
even if it's not pinpointing an exact number.
Yeah, and sometimes just knowing a range or even just the direction of change,
Right.
that can be way more valuable than some like misleadingly precise figure,
Yeah, that makes
which is ultimately inaccurate.
So if we can actually like measure more than we think, why do we even like label some things as immeasurable?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What's the deal with that?
Hubbard identifies 3 main reasons why we tend to think that.
Okay, let's hear it.
First, we often lack a clear definition of what we're even trying to measure in the first place.
Okay.
So, for example, if you're trying to measure something like happiness,
Right.
how do you even define that?
It's so vague.
It's too vague.
Yeah, it's like trying to measure the size of a cloud without knowing what shape it is.
Exactly. And then the second reason is we might just be unfamiliar with the methods for collecting relevant data.
Okay.
We might just assume something's impossible to measure just because we don't know how to gather the right information.
Okay. Yeah.
And this is where the book gets really interesting.
Yeah.
It actually introduces some surprisingly straightforward methods to measure things that we often dismiss as too complex or too subjective.
There's this great story in the book about Emily Rosa. Have you heard of her?
I have, yeah.
She was 9 years old when she became the youngest person to have research published in a respected medical journal.
That's amazing. What did she do?
So she did this really cool science fair project.
Oh, wow.
She challenged the legitimacy of therapeutic touch,
Oh, yeah.
you know, where practitioners claim to manipulate these energy fields for healing.
Interesting.
So it's a perfect example of how even these seemingly woo-woo concepts can be put to the test. Her experiment, it was really simple, showed that these practitioners couldn't actually sense her hand over theirs any better than random chance.
Wow.
So it kind of casts some serious doubt on the validity of their claims.
Yeah, it really highlights the power of simple, well-designed observation to sort of demystify these concepts.
Right. And then another example from the book, the MITRE Information Infrastructure, or MII.
Okay.
It's this knowledge-based system that was built to try to enhance collaboration.
Okay.
But the fascinating thing about this case is they didn't try to directly measure something as broad as, like, improved collaboration.
Yeah, how would you even...
Right. What they focused on was a much more tangible question. Could users even perceive a difference in, like, the quality of work after the system was implemented?
So they kind of broke it down into
Yeah.
something more measurable.
More tangible.
Yeah.
And speaking of finding ways to simplify measurement, one of the most intriguing concepts in this book is the rule of 5.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of that.
Have you? So this is where Hubbard asks, can you really be 93% confident about the median of an entire population just by looking at a random sample of 5?
Sounds a little too good to be true, doesn't it?
It does. How's that even possible?
It might seem counterintuitive, but even small samples can reduce uncertainty dramatically.
So for anyone who wants valuable insights but doesn't want to get lost in a sea of data,
Right.
this is amazing.
Yeah, this is great news. Think about it. If you know absolutely nothing about a set of values, the first few random samples you take actually give you a surprising amount of information.
So how does it actually work?
Well, the median is the middle value in a sorted set of numbers.
Right.
In a random sample of 5, there's actually a high probability that the true median of the whole population falls between the smallest and largest values in your sample.
Okay.
So you're not aiming for absolute certainty, but you're significantly narrowing down the possibilities.
Okay, so we have these tools to reduce uncertainty.
Mm.
But how can we actually assess how good we are at estimating in the first place?
Mhm.
Like, how do we calibrate our intuition?
That's a crucial question. Hubbard points out that most people are actually terrible at judging their own accuracy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Are you consistently overconfident in your predictions or underconfident? Most of us don't really know. He
Yeah.
has some really fascinating calibration exercises in the book that can help you become more aware of your own biases and really improve your estimation skills.
So while we won't put you through those exercises here,
Right.
I think you'll be really surprised by how much your intuition can improve with just a bit of practice and feedback.
Mhm.
So we've talked about reducing uncertainty and calibrating our intuition, but how do we actually apply all of this to make better decisions?
That's where applied information economics comes in, or what Hubbard calls AIE.
Okay, AIE. I like it.
It's his framework for approaching measurement strategically.
Okay.
It's not about just randomly picking metrics. AIE poses critical questions. It asks, what should we measure?
Right.
How much effort should we invest?
Yeah.
And most importantly, how will this information that we gather actually inform our decisions?
So a really good example that he uses in the book is the EPA's evaluation of the Safe Drinking Water Information System,
SDWIS.
or SDWIS.
Yeah.
They needed to basically justify the cost of potential improvements to the system.
Okay.
They were already tracking things like the number of violations and correction times,
Right.
but those metrics alone didn't really tell the whole story.
Of course not.
Right. They needed to connect those metrics back to the ultimate goal of improving public health.
Right. But how do you measure something as complex and seemingly intangible as public health?
Exactly. And that's where AIE comes in.
Okay.
So by breaking down this big problem
Right.
into smaller measurable parts, the EPA was able to create a model that linked SDWIS modifications to tangible outcomes like reduced illness and fewer lost workdays.
Oh.
So this model allowed them to actually quantify the potential benefits of the system
Hard.
and compare those benefits to the costs.
Right.
And ultimately, it showed that even small improvements in data collection and reporting could have a huge positive impact on public health.
So they realized they could make a real difference with what seemed like small changes.
Yeah, and this isn't just about like crunching numbers or whatever.
Right.
It's about using data to make informed decisions about how to allocate resources.
Precisely. The EPA's example shows that even a concept as complex as public health can be measured and used to guide those real-world actions.
Okay, so you've convinced me that we can measure more than we thought. But how do we actually figure out what to measure? Like, where do we even begin?
Well, Hubbard gives us this really helpful cascade of questions to kind of guide us in choosing the right metrics.
Okay.
And the first question to ask is, what are the components of the thing that we're uncertain about?
So we need to break down that big, scary intangible into smaller, manageable pieces, like the EPA did with the SDWIS and those health outcomes.
Exactly. It's about finding those tangible entry points.
Okay, good.
And then the second question is, has this or its components been measured by others?
Right.
Yeah.
We don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly.
Someone else might have already tackled a similar measurement problem.
Right. We can look for benchmarks or industry studies or academic research.
Okay.
You'd be surprised what's out there already.
Okay, so the third question then is, how do those observables lend themselves to measurement?
Right.
So this is where we get into the nuts and bolts
Exactly.
of choosing the right data collection methods.
Yeah.
So I'm starting to see how this framework really helps navigate the measurement process.
Right.
It feels way less daunting now.
Yeah. And then Hubbard also offers this really practical set of questions to guide us in selecting those methods.
Okay.
He suggests asking 5 key questions. First one, can you directly observe this thing?
Okay.
Sometimes the answer is a straightforward yes, and we can move on. But if not, we need to dig a little deeper.
Makes sense. So if we can't directly observe it, then we ask, can you observe something that tells you about this thing?
Right. This is where we might start looking for indirect indicators or proxies.
Like clues.
Exactly.
Help us understand.
Think about trying to measure something like employee morale.
Right.
You can't directly observe morale itself,
Right.
but you can observe things like absentee rates
Oh.
or employee turnover, and
Right.
that might give you some insight.
Okay, so what if we still can't observe anything directly or indirectly?
Then we go to the third question. Can you create a way to observe this thing?
Okay.
So this is where we might need to design experiments or run simulations or even develop new tools for collecting data.
So we get to be creative,
Right.
design our own ways to gather that information.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that. What if we think that this thing has been leaving a trail, but we just haven't been paying attention?
Right. So then we get to question 4. If this thing has been leaving a trail, can you find it? So this is about looking for existing data that we might have overlooked,
Okay.
like customer purchase records, website traffic logs, or even internal emails.
That's like detective work.
It is.
Searching for those clues that are already there.
Exactly.
Okay, and finally, if there's no trail to follow, then what?
Then question 5. If this thing hasn't been leaving a trail, can you devise a way to begin tracking it now?
Okay, so now we're being proactive.
Exactly. We can use techniques like tagging or tracing or implement new data collection points into our processes.
So this framework gives us a really clear roadmap for turning the unobservable into something we can actually measure.
Right.
But it sounds like we shouldn't overdo it.
Right.
We only need to measure enough to reduce the uncertainty
Yeah.
to help us make a better decision.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the pursuit of perfect data,
Yeah,
but often good enough is sufficient.
right.
We need to be mindful of the cost and effort involved in measurement and really focus on the data that's going to have the most impact.
So how do we determine what data will have the biggest impact?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that we're not drowning in data, but we're actually extracting valuable insights?
That's where the concept of information value comes in.
Yeah.
It's not just about the quantity of data.
Right.
It's about the quality and relevance of that data
Right.
to our decision-making process.
So we need to be strategic
Exactly.
about what we measure
Yeah.
and make sure it aligns with our goals,
Right.
the decisions we need to make.
AIE encourages us to be really thoughtful about our measurement efforts.
Okay.
Choose the most important variables and invest in measurement only when the potential value of that information outweighs the cost.
So this makes me think about some of those newer tools and approaches to measurement that Hubbard talks about.
Yeah.
Like prediction markets
Oh, yeah.
to tap into collective wisdom.
Yeah. So prediction markets, or crowd forecasting platforms, as they're sometimes called,
Okay.
harness the collective insights of a group to try to predict future events.
So it's like a stock market, but instead of trading shares of companies,
Right.
you're trading shares of predictions.
Exactly.
So you can have a market predicting whether a specific product will launch on time
Right.
or whether a certain candidate will win an election.
Exactly. And the idea is that by combining the predictions of many individuals,
Okay.
you can actually get a more accurate forecast than relying on a single expert.
Yeah.
And research has shown that these prediction markets can be surprisingly accurate.
Really?
Yeah, often outperforming traditional forecasting methods.
Wow.
Because they leverage that diverse knowledge and perspectives of a crowd, and that market mechanism incentivizes people to update their predictions as new information comes in.
So it's like this constantly evolving real-time forecasting engine.
It is.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's a very valuable approach in so many business contexts, from predicting sales trends to assessing project risks.
Okay.
It's definitely a tool worth exploring.
So what about some of the less conventional methods?
Oh, yeah, like using the internet as this massive data collection tool.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
How would that work?
We can use things like web scraping tools to collect data from websites, analyze social media trends to kind of gauge public sentiment,
Oh, that's interesting.
or even conduct online surveys
Right?
to gather feedback from customers or employees.
So the internet is like this constantly evolving data ecosystem,
It is.
and all the tools and techniques are always changing.
Right. It's a really exciting time to be interested in measurement.
Yeah, it is.
The beauty of Hubbard's approach is that it's so adaptable
Right.
to all sorts of contexts and challenges.
So whether we're trying to measure employee morale or brand reputation or the value of a new product,
Right.
the principles of AIE can help us
Exactly.
approach the problem
Yeah.
and find the right tools.
It feels empowering.
It does.
And remember, it's all about reducing uncertainty
Right.
and making better decisions. So don't be afraid to get creative, experiment, and find the methods that work best for you.
So this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the possibilities of measurement.
Right.
I'm starting to see the world in a whole new way,
It's pretty cool.
full of hidden data and unexpected opportunities.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I want to touch on one more crucial aspect of measurement. How do we actually make sense of the data?
Right.
How do we turn it into actionable insights?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Like, it's not enough to just gather the data.
Right.
We have to actually do something with it,
Right.
analyze it, interpret it,
Right.
and then present it in a way that helps us make those informed decisions.
So this is where like the magic of statistics and data visualization comes in.
Right.
We can use statistical techniques to find those patterns and trends.
Yeah.
And then create those charts and graphs to actually make those patterns visible,
Exactly.
which would make it easier to communicate the findings to others too, right?
Absolutely. Visualizing data can be so powerful. But we also need to be aware of the potential pitfalls
Right.
of data analysis.
Yeah, like what kinds of things?
Well, it's really easy to misinterpret correlations as causation
Oh, right.
or to cherry pick data.
Right. To support our biases.
Exactly. Or to draw conclusions from a sample that's too small.
So we need to approach data analysis with a critical eye
Absolutely.
and acknowledge our own preconceived notions.
Yeah.
We can't manipulate the data
Right.
to tell the story that we want it to tell.
Exactly. Hubbard has some really great advice in the book on how to avoid those common mistakes and ensure that your analysis is both rigorous and reliable.
Okay.
He also stresses the importance of being transparent about the limitations of your data.
Okay.
We should never present our findings as absolute truths,
Right.
but instead acknowledge that inherent uncertainty in any measurement process.
Right. It's about being honest about what the data can and cannot tell us.
Exactly.
This reminds me of something else that Hubbard mentioned, Bayesian statistics.
Oh, yeah.
Can you remind me what that is exactly?
So Bayesian statistics is named after this 18th century statistician Thomas Bayes.
Okay.
And it's all about updating our beliefs as we gather new information.
Okay.
So it's a way to combine our prior knowledge with new data
Right.
to arrive at more informed conclusions.
Okay.
So rather than starting from scratch every time we encounter new data,
Right.
we can actually use Bayesian methods to build on what we already know
Okay.
and refine our understanding over time.
It sounds like a really intuitive way to think about measurement.
It is.
It acknowledges that we always have some level of pre-existing knowledge about the world,
Right.
and our beliefs should evolve as we gather new information.
And it's especially useful when you're dealing with limited data or highly uncertain situations.
Okay.
Bayesian methods allow us to make the most of the information we have,
Right.
even if it's incomplete or imperfect.
This whole conversation has really like transformed how I view measurement.
Has it?
Yeah. I'm seeing the world through a new lens. One that recognizes like this hidden data
Right.
and unexpected opportunities for measurement everywhere I look.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
As we become more comfortable with these principles and we expand our toolkit of measurement methods,
Right.
we just open up this whole world of possibilities.
For understanding and improving our businesses, our communities,
Yeah.
even ourselves.
Absolutely.
And, you know, when we think about measurement, we often jump to those concrete things
Yeah.
like sales figures or website traffic.
Yeah.
But Hubbard really encourages us to think bigger.
Yeah.
To consider measuring things like employee morale or even the value of saving a life.
And those might seem impossible to quantify at first glance,
Right.
but Hubbard argues that we can measure them if we
Yeah.
break them down into their component parts and identify those observable indicators.
So instead of getting overwhelmed by like the enormity of employee morale,
Right.
we could look at things like absentee rates or employee turnover.
Or even the results of anonymous surveys.
Right. It's about finding those measurable proxies.
Exactly. And while it's a sensitive topic, the value of saving a life can actually be approached through methods like the value of a statistical life.
I've heard of that, yeah.
This method analyzes how much people are willing to pay to reduce their risk of death
Okay.
and uses that information to estimate the economic value of saving a life.
It's so fascinating how these complex and often ethically charged concepts
Right.
can be approached through this measurement lens.
Yeah,
It helps us make more informed decisions.
absolutely. About workplace policies or public safety investments or even environmental regulations.
So measurement isn't just about collecting data for the sake of it.
Right.
It's about using that data to make more informed choices, solve problems,
Yeah.
and ultimately improve our lives.
Exactly.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me.
It has.
I'm starting to see measurement as this incredibly powerful tool,
It is.
not just for scientists or statisticians, but for anyone who wants to make better decisions in all areas of life.
I completely agree. It's about empowering ourselves with knowledge, reducing uncertainty, and making those more informed choices.
Right.
And as we've explored today, even things that seem impossible to measure can be understood and quantified if we approach them with the right mindset and a willingness to explore.
So if you're feeling inspired to start measuring the immeasurables in your own world, I have a question for you.
Okay.
What else might be more measurable than you think?
Don't be afraid to challenge those assumptions.
Right.
And get creative. You might be amazed by what you discover.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of measurement.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time for another adventure in knowledge exploration.